President Trump was due to visit President Xi in China, but he postponed that visit because of the war in Iran, something that further complicates a relationship that was already complicated. Nicholas Burns served as U.S. ambassador to China. That capped a distinguished diplomatic career in which he was Undersecretary of State as well as ambassador to Greece and to NATO. He is now professor at Harvard's Kennedy School. Ambassador Burns, there was supposed to be a summit coming up in China between President Xi and President Trump. Got postponed because of the Iran war. Give us your perspective on what role the Iran war plays in U.S.-China relations.
It's had a decisive impact on the U.S.-China relationship this winter and spring because, of course, China's fundamentally engaged economically in Iran, importing 1.3 million barrels a day on a discount that favors the Chinese. And the Chinese have major investments, in fact, greater investments in the Arab Gulf states than they do in Iran. So their interests have been fundamentally affected. And of course, President Trump, I think rightfully, sensibly took the view in the middle of a war, he couldn't go off to Beijing to stand beside Xi Jinping and have 3 days of summitry. He had to be at his desk running the war. So I understood the decision by President Trump and supported it.
President Trump has called upon various nations to help, particularly with the Strait of Hormuz, including China. Is China picking sides in this?
China is very much attached to Iran as a political ally. But I think we've seen in the Chinese reaction over the last 3 or 4 weeks of this war that the Chinese care a lot more about the predictable supply of oil and gas coming out of the Strait of Hormuz because they're dependent to a very large extent on that flow of energy. And their investments in the United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Kuwait are far more substantial than what they had coming from Iran. So I think they're of two minds about this. They didn't want to see their political ally bludgeoned the way it has. But it's interesting, David, they haven't really lifted a finger to help politically and diplomatically Iran. They're much more focused on ending the Iranian missile attacks at the Gulf Arab oil and gas refineries. I think they want a quick end to the war itself. And one of the intriguing questions here is, there's going to be an end game. There's going to be an attempt to resolve this by diplomacy. Can China play a role in that? And I would say behind the scenes pushing the Iranians to an agreement. That would be, I think, the American hope that they might do that.
So that is promising, potentially, if China were to play some role in that. Given history, has China done that in the past? Has it typically played that sort of behind-the-scenes role?
It has not. It has in its own region. For instance, Myanmar, which is a neighboring border state. China is fundamentally involved in trying to steer the course of the civil war there. But the Chinese have not taken the step, as the United States has been doing now for 7 or 8 decades, of being a peacemaker and a leading diplomatic actor. I will say this. When I was in Beijing 2 years ago, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, presided over a ceremonial handshake, you may remember this, between the Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers. And the Chinese then began to message me and kind of in my face say, we're a big power in the Middle East now. Well, they haven't been present in the negotiations to date. Over the last 3 or 4 weeks, it's been the United States and Israel and the Gulf Arabs being the major actors in this drama with Iran. So I think China, in a way, has taken a hit on its political credibility. If you combine their lack of action to support effectively Iran diplomatically, I never thought they would intervene militarily, and combine that with their silence, really, when the United States went into Venezuela in the early part of January, I think they look like a fickle friend to both the Iranians and also the Venezuelans. But there's another side of this coin. Xi Jinping has been positioning himself throughout this first year and a quarter of Donald Trump's second term in office. He says, and this is quite hypocritical, by the way, and you can see through it, but it has some resonance in the global South. We're the predictable country. We're the upholder of stability in the world, both economic and politically. We defend the United Nations Charter. Counterpoint in this duel that he and President Trump are having, a friendly duel in some respects as to which leader is the most respected global leader now.
The world is necessarily focused right now on Iran and what's going on with the war there, and will be until that's resolved some way. But there were a lot of expectations for this planned summit between President Xi and President Trump before that. Go back before the Iran war. What were the major issues between these two countries?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Scott Bessent, Secretary Bessent, had taken the lead in preparing this summit for President Trump, which is a little bit unusual. Normally, in the last few decades, it would have been the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor. And that tells you a lot. I think President Trump is seeking some degree of economic and financial stability with the Iranians after the wild roller coaster ride from Liberation Day last spring on. And what the two sides were working out, and I very much think this is a good idea, a truce in the tariff war. The tariffs won't change much, but there'll be a certainty that until the end of this calendar year in 2026, both countries will stay at their current levels, and that helps. It helps markets with predictability. It helps the global economy and the two individual economies. Second, a truce in the supply chain wars. So China would agree through the end of 2026, it's not going to withhold rare earths or rare earth magnets from the global market. The United States would agree it would not play the cards that it played in the supply chain wars with computer parts, airplane parts, that kind of thing. That's also, I think, positive. Third, the United States agricultural industry depends on exports to China. In fact, China is the largest export market. In most years, 1/5 of all of our agricultural exports go to that one market, China. And the Chinese, over the last couple of years, including when I was ambassador, in the last 2 years of my time there, 2023 and 24, reduced significantly their purchases of American soybeans and sorghum and wheat and pork products. And that had a big negative impact on American agriculture. So President Trump, and again, I think this is a good idea, has been promoting the fact that we need to return to much higher purchases by the Chinese government. And then fentanyl, David, has been thrown into this as well. As you know, it's the leading cause of death in our society, Americans 18 to 49. And the majority of the precursor chemicals come from the Chinese black market, not from the government of China, but the black market. We made, I thought, significant inroads into this in the last year and a half of the Biden administration. I worked very closely with the Chinese government to try to reduce the black market sale of this. And President Trump, I think, has done a good job keeping this alive as an issue. So those are 4 issues where I think when this summit is rescheduled could turn out to be net positive for the economic relationship. And as recently as 2 years ago, we had a $750 billion two-way trade relationship in goods and services. This is a very substantial market for American companies. You know, we've talked a lot, David, about the war in Iran, which has been catastrophic in the short term for the global economy and energy flows. We talked about what's happening in Europe with Putin trying to cross the brightest red line, take over someone else's state. In the long term, there's a greater interest. China. China is out to outcompete the United States. China wants to overtake us militarily in the Indo-Pacific. They think that by putting a major state investments into AI, quantum computing, biotechnology, cyber technology, space technology, they will become the technological champion of the world in the 2030s and 40s and 50s. We simply can't let that happen. So we can't take our eye off the big challenge, which is we do need to pivot to the Indo-Pacific so that we can work with our allies, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, our partner India, to outcompete the Chinese. And I'm afraid that another Middle East war was not in our interest. And so that, to me, for future presidents, Republican and Democrat, for our kids, David, in my case, our grandchildren, we've got to keep our eye on the China competition.